Let's take a ride through the epic story of ancient Egypt, from its earliest days to the golden age of the Pharaohs. Buckle in. You're about to witness endless grit. Origins, before the sands picture northern Africa, not as a sea of dunes, but as a lush green land filled with life. We're stepping back roughly 8,000 years ago, long before pyramids or pharaohs, when early Homo sapiens lived as hunter-gatherers. But wait, in the Sahara? Yes, the Sahara Desert, now one of the driest places on Earth, was once in the middle of an era known as the Green Sahara, or the African Humid Period. During this time, the region experienced significant rainfall, transforming it into a green savanna teeming with rivers and lakes. Think grasslands, scattered forests, and thunderstorms rolling across the horizon. Honestly, it was more Florida than desert, minus the theme parks and the humidity complaints. Fish, farms, and first settlements fish followed lakes and rivers. Lots of fish. Although hunting never truly ceased, fishing formed the basis of life. Agriculture started to take hold as people began to cultivate wheat and barley, thousands of years prior to figuring out how to make beer with them. It was tragic. They started to domesticate animals and available even more time for fishing or, for that matter, whatever the earliest version of leisure was. The change was monumental. Increased food production meant that people could begin to settle down. Houses emerged, humble mud brick structures. Then came pottery for cooking, storing, and, let's be honest, likely thrown at each other for forgetting to weed the crop. And when the green disappeared, just when it seemed perfect, climate change came in like a wrecking ball. The rainfall started to disappear. The lakes dried up. The grasslands would yellow, then dry out, and ultimately surrender to the relentless, encroaching desert. These communities of hardy folks were faced with a new reality, gathered what they could carry, livestock, clay jugs, maybe a few fishing spears, and headed east. Many followed the promise of water, eventually arriving at one of the great historical lifelines, the Nile River. The Nile Valley by about 6000 BCE. People settled along the banks of the Nile. Here living was not only sustainable, it was advantageous. The Nile provided a solid source of water year-round, rich farmland, and most importantly, protection from natural barriers. The Nile Valley was surrounded by desert on both sides, meaning that it was safeguarded from most invasions, and even offered a pathway for trade and communication. This is where the first pieces of ancient Egypt took root. The communities grew into towns. The towns started to build the foundations for what would ultimately become one of the greatest civilizations in human history, built on determination, adaptability, and of course, that special, endless grit. To be continued, and that's just the beginning. We haven't even gotten to pyramids, gods, or the rise of pharaohs yet. Stay tuned, because the next chapters in Egypt's story are even more astonishing, and they wouldn't have happened without the resilience and resourcefulness that defined the earliest chapters of this epic endless grit. It's what turned hunters into farmers, wanderers into builders, and the Nile into the heartbeat of a civilization. From families to cities, as people began living closer together in permanent settlements, something powerful began to form: community. With it came shared spaces, markets to trade, gathering areas for discussions. Probably not quite your modern-day HOA meetings, but still, the first taste of civic life. One of the earliest signs of true urban life in ancient Egypt came from what we now call the Merimd culture, which thrived between roughly 4800 and 4300 BCE. Located in the western Nile Delta, Merimd wasn't just clusters of homes, it was one of the earliest organized towns. We're talking about a civilization on the cusp of endless grit. Divided by geography, united by the Nile over time, two distinct political and cultural regions began to take shape: Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. And yes, that sounds backwards. But remember, the Nile River flows from south to north, so upper refers to the upstream southern region, while lower is downriver in the north. Geography has its quirks. Most rivers, like the Amazon or Mississippi, aren't this fancy. But the Nile, this one flows against the grain, a little rebellious, a little elite, classic traits of endless grit, harsh terrain, and harsher attitudes. Upper Egypt was a narrow strip of fertile land, flanked by unforgiving desert. And let's be honest, have you ever heard of a gentle desert? Harsh is kind of in the job description. This tough terrain shaped the culture. Upper Egypt became militaristic, a warrior society always looking for room to grow. With limited farmland squeezed between riverbanks and desert, expanding north was their only real option. Their rulers wore a white crown, symbolizing authority over this rugged land. Meanwhile, Lower Egypt, sprawling across the more fertile delta, was calmer, more trade-focused, and way less into starting fights. Its likely capital, Buto, became a vibrant trade hub with connections stretching into Mesopotamia and the Levant. Their crown? Red, and just as symbolic. Though the two kingdoms traded occasionally, rivalry simmered beneath the surface. Upper Egypt kept looking northward with desire, and maybe a touch of envy. Conflict brews. Enter the unifier. Eventually, diplomacy gave way to domination. A powerful figure from Upper Egypt decided enough was enough. His name? Narmer or Mens, depending on the source. Many believe he was the son of a local ruler, possibly the legendary King Scorpion. And while we're not entirely sure, early Egypt hadn't quite invented writing yet, we do know this. Narmer came from a line of leaders driven by endless grit. If you've seen The Scorpion King starring The Rock, no doubt Hollywood got a few things dramatically wrong, but the mythological echo persists. Compared to Scorpion, Menes sounds less fearsome, but don't let the name fool you. Around 3100 BCE, Menes led a campaign downriver and conquered Lower Egypt. And with most of the northerners unprepared for invasion, let's just say they weren't exactly battle-hardened. The takeover wasn't much of a struggle. Proof in stone, you might be wondering how we even know about battles from over 5,000 years ago. Enter the Narmer Palette, a flat ceremonial stone slab discovered in 1898. About 64 cm tall and 42 cm wide, this artifact contains some of the earliest hieroglyphic inscriptions ever found. One side shows Narmer in the white crown of Upper Egypt, striking down his enemies. The other side, he's rocking the red crown of Lower Egypt. This duality is powerful. It marks the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt and the beginning of Egypt as a single, organized kingdom. Narmer didn't just create a country, he became Egypt's first pharaoh, blending political authority with religious power. He was seen as the earthly embodiment of Horus, Egypt's falcon-headed god of protection and kingship. When your ruler claims divine DNA, there's not a lot of room for public debate. From this point on, divine kingship would define Egypt's monarchy for thousands of years. Memphis. The birth of a capital is part of his unification strategy. Narmer founded Memphis, near the boundary of the former two kingdoms. Strategically placed in the Nile Delta, Memphis became both a political capital and a cultural beacon. In time, Memphis would explode in influence, home to over 100,000 people, adorned with temples, palaces, and busy ports. It stood as proof that one man's endless grit could shape the destiny of an entire civilization. And no, while there's no evidence of ancient Egypt's take on barbecue ribs, we can dream. From war to writing with unification came centralized government, and eventually, writing, finally giving historians something more reliable than legends and stone carvings. Egyptian art, language, trade, and architecture began evolving rapidly, paving the way for the next great chapters in this incredible story. And to think, it all started with warriors, farmers, and a river that ran the wrong way. Closing line, the legacy of endless grit. Narmer's legacy wasn't just in crowns or conquest. It was in the foundation he laid for something eternal. Ancient Egypt wasn't built overnight, but it was started by people who refused to bend to nature, time, or odds. Endless grit turned scattered towns into the heartbeat of civilization. One brick, one battle, one belief at a time. Once people start hanging paintings on the wall, you can bet there's someone nearby ready to critique the brushstrokes. But this wasn't just art for art's sake. It was the beginning of something bigger. Over the next 500 years, Egypt entered what we now call the Old Kingdom. Of course, back then, they didn't name it that. To them, it wasn't old, just the kingdom. But oh, what a kingdom it was. Starting from the 3rd dynasty and lasting through the 6th, this era saw some of the most ambitious architectural projects in human history. They didn't call it the Age of Pyramids because of some cleverly disguised pyramid schemes. These Egyptians weren't selling hopes and dreams, they were building them. Step up. The first pyramid builders. The story kicks off with King Djoser, pronounced Djoser, the first ruler of the 3rd dynasty, a man who leaned heavily into the whole god-king concept. and with him came one of the ancient world's greatest minds, Imhotep, not just a high priest and physician, but Egypt's first named architect. Together, they broke new ground, literally, and built the step pyramid at Saqqara. Unlike anything seen before, this structure towered above the desert like a staircase to the divine. Side note: if you're looking to find your tribe of fellow history buffs, try rolling up with a vanity plate that says, "I am Hot P." You'll confuse many, but the few who honk in approval? Solid people. Expanding the realm with endless grit, Djoser wasn't just about bricks. He was also about borders. He led successful campaigns to conquer the Sinai Peninsula, unlocking access to rich copper and turquoise mines. With that came trade, wealth, and the ability to produce some of the first ancient bling, marketed heavily to anyone who couldn't resist shiny things, even if they were terribly overpriced and slightly tacky. Egypt was growing, not just in wealth, but in ambition. Enter the Fourth Dynasty, and with it, one of history's greatest real estate ventures, Giza, a wonder-rich neighborhood. The Fourth Dynasty gave us the great builders of Giza, including Khufu, builder of the Great Pyramid, Khafra, and Menkaure. Along with their pyramid complexes came the construction of the Great Sphinx, possibly bearing the likeness of Khafra himself. These monuments were more than tombs. They were bold stone declarations about divine kingship, engineering power, and a society so organized it could build mega projects without the help of AI or PowerPoint. For decades, thousands labored through floods and droughts, winters and blazing sun. Not aliens, though. Let's leave that theory in the movies. What these builders had was far more impressive: endless grit and coordinated will. Rise of a new god, Ra ascends. By the time we enter the 5th and 6th dynasties, Egypt started looking skyward, literally. Temples were built to honor the sun god Ra, who was rising in popularity faster than any TikTok trend. Pharaohs embraced him so fully that they began claiming direct descent from the solar deity. The image of the pharaoh drifted from just a king to the son of Ra, walking the earth, a clever blend of power and PR that cemented both faith and obedience. Around this time, rulers began to delegate governance to regional officials called nomarchs, a practical move that helped manage a growing and complex society. But the more power you hand out, the harder it can be to get it back. Long reign, slow decline, the story of Pepi. The last significant figure of the Old Kingdom was Pepi II, who climbed the throne at the tender age of 6. And he wasn't just a child king. He went on to rule for an eye-watering 90 years. To put that in perspective, in an age when turning 40 made you a village elder, Pepi was still attending royal meetings in a wheelchair long after many of his original advisors had faded into the sand. But longevity doesn't guarantee stability. As Pepi aged, Egypt fractured. The local governors who once answered to the pharaoh began gaining their own power bases. At the same time, drought and famine struck, crops failed, people starved, and faith in centralized rule began to wither. Everyone around the aging king kept insisting everything was fine, and we all know how that turns out. Eventually, the Old Kingdom collapsed, ushering in what historians call the First Intermediate Period, a time of regional rule, weakened central power, and nationwide uncertainty. As for how Pepi went out, history doesn't say, but after 90 years at the helm, let's just say the smart money is on natural causes. Looking ahead, the Old Kingdom left behind more than pyramids and monuments. It established the template of divinity, governance, and infrastructure that future dynasties would both build upon and struggle to maintain. And despite the cracks that ended this golden age, Egypt's soul remained unbroken, driven by endless grit, innovation, and belief in something bigger than themselves. Because in Egypt, even when kingdoms fell, the spirit to rise remained eternal, a familiar pattern. If there's one thing you start noticing by now, it's the pattern. Egypt would shine under a strong leader, then falter when power crumbled, followed by chaos, division, and disappointment. But eventually, someone ambitious enough would rise, unite the country, and reboot the entire dynasty machine. Rinse, rebuild, repeat. After the collapse of the Old Kingdom and the harsh period known as the First Intermediate Period, the dynasties to the north ruled by the Heracleopolitan kings continued to exist, if only barely. However, There didn't seem to be many who were still concerned with that arrangement, particularly the people to the south in Thebes, who, as was their nature, weren't exactly the kind to sit still. There had been far too much time since the Southerners had answered with forced action to reorganize their neighbors. A new unifier, Mentuhotep III BCE, a ruler from Thebes named Mentuhotep II, marched north to fight against and defeat the Heracleopolitans and proclaim himself the sole ruler of Egypt. Not only was this the beginning of the 11th dynasty, it also marked the beginning of the Middle Kingdom. Mentuhotep II moved capital operations to Thebes, a city that would go on to become a spiritual and political powerhouse. Agriculture boomed again, trade routes reopened, and as always, a shiny new god joined the spotlight. The Gospel of Osiris, hope for the people. During this rebirth, one god rose higher than even the Nile's floodwaters: Osiris, ruler of the underworld. What made Osiris so appealing wasn't just his mystique. For the first time in Egyptian history, the idea of an afterlife wasn't reserved for pharaohs alone. If you lived a moral life and observed the proper rituals, even a farmer, a fisherman, or a stable hand could hope for eternal paradise. The divine hierarchy had shifted, and hope became a little more democratic. Still, none of it would have rediscovered balance without a central power guiding it, and that momentum continued into the 12th dynasty. Capital shift. Welcome to Ichtawi. The 12th dynasty kicked off under Amenemhat I, a capable ruler who wasn't sold on daily commuting into Thebes. So, what did he do? He built an entirely new capital, Ichtawi, located near the modern city of Lisht, just south of today's Cairo. If you're keeping score, that made it more central and way more efficient for monitoring both Upper and Lower Egypt. From this new seat of power, Egypt saw one of its major golden ages. Art flourished, administration was tightened, and Egyptian literature achieved some of its greatest early works: tales of morality, leadership, and the purpose of power. No word on whether Zen and the art of chariot maintenance was real, but if it was, you'd best believe it sold out fast. The fall. Weak kings, strong problems, things were smooth, until they weren't. Enter the 13th dynasty. Unlike the sturdy rule of the 12th, this period was scattered and unstable. From 1759 BCE to 1695 BCE, nearly every new pharaoh who took power was gone within just a few years. The only exception? Sobekotep I, who managed more than 5 years on the throne, which, during that era, pretty much made him a seasoned veteran. But chaos crept in. Without consistent leadership from the top, regional rulers, especially in the Nile Delta, began grabbing more autonomy. And just like that, Egypt's defenses weakened. Newcomers at the gate. The arrival of the Hyksos. Enter the Hyksos, a people of Semitic origin whose name literally translates to rulers of foreign lands. That's your first red flag. The Hyksos likely came from Canaan, in the region we now call modern-day Syria, Jordan, and Israel. But they didn't arrive with armies or banners. They came gradually, as traders, immigrants, and even mercenaries. Over decades, they blended into Egyptian life, learning the language, adopting customs, and building influence from the inside. Some Egyptians welcomed them. Others were wary, but few fully grasped that these foreign settlers were playing the long game and would soon claim a throne of their own. Looking ahead, Egypt's resilience on the horizon, the Middle Kingdom, while brimming with art, governance, and spiritual awakening, had fallen victim to an old vulnerability, inconsistency at the top. But Egypt wasn't done yet. Even as outsiders prepared to seize power and local rulers grasped for independence, the spirit that had carried this civilization through centuries refused to break. Endless. Grit doesn't just come from victory. It comes from knowing how to rise again and again, even when the storm clouds roll in. Trouble brews in the deltas. Foreign influence grew in the eastern Nile Delta. A new power base slowly emerged. These outsiders, known as the Hyksos, migrated. In overtime, gaining numbers, wealth, and eventually political clout. By around 1650 BCE, they didn't just blend in. They took control of Lower Egypt, establishing the 15th dynasty. And while the Hyksos adopted many aspects of Egyptian culture, the locals saw them for what they were: foreign rulers. That resentment ran deep. Division and defiance up in the north, the Hyksos ruled from their capital in Avaris, flexing political and military dominance. But down south, the city of Thebes had other ideas. Leaders in Thebes, determined not to roll over, formed their own royal line, establishing the 16th and eventually the 17th dynasties. While they were forced to pay tribute to the Hyksos, they maintained a surprising degree of autonomy, and more importantly, patience, until diplomatically, things got weird. The hippopotamus crisis, T some point, Sekenenretau, a southern ruler based in Thebes, received a curious challenge from the Hyksos king, Apepi I. According to later writings, Apepi complained that the noise from hippos in Thebes' sacred pool was disturbing him, all the way in Avaris, which is hundreds of miles away. Now, either the Hyksos king had supernatural hearing, or this was less about animals and more about political provocation. Scholars believe it was meant to mock or test Thebes' resolve. Whatever the motive for Sekenenretau, it was the final insult. He declared war and sacrifice. Unfortunately, launching a rebellion against a seasoned occupying power is easier said than done. Sekenenretau led his forces northward, but was likely killed in battle. His mummified remains found in the 1800s displayed severe cranial wounds, suggesting he died either in combat or by execution. But while they lost a leader, they didn't lose momentum. His son, Kamose, carried the fight to the Hyksos, and after his death, the baton passed to Amosawand, who finished what his family had started. Fighting smarter with foreign tools, Amos did something particularly clever. He turned the invaders' own weapons against them. The Hyksos had introduced new military technology, including horse-drawn chariots, composite bows, and bronze weaponry. Ahmos's forces adapted quickly, equipped themselves with the same advancements, and drove the Hyksos out of Egypt once and for all. Talk about poetic justice. A new chapter. The new kingdom begins. This victory marked the birth of the 18th dynasty and the dawn of the new kingdom, the third and final great period of ancient Egyptian unity and expansion. Ahmose was hailed as a national hero, and suddenly Egypt wasn't just recovering, it was dominating the region, and nothing united the people quite like victory over foreign invaders, endless grit in its purest form. Yet, this was just the beginning. What came next would break one of the deepest traditions in Egyptian history. Breaking the papyrus ceiling, Hatshepsut rises. For the first time ever, a woman would rule as pharaoh, not as queen, consort, or regent, but as king in her own right. Her name was Hatshepsut, and in one of history's greatest political maneuvers, she rose through the ranks as the stepmother of the young heir, Thutmose III. Traditionally, a regent would rule only until the child pharaoh came of age. By teen years, the boy would typically assume the throne, and the regent would step quietly aside. Hatshepsut had a different plan. She never gave the seat back. Instead, she claimed the full title and regalia of pharaoh, depicted herself in statues and carvings in male form, even with the traditional false beard worn by kings, making it clear this was her time. A reign of prosperity, she didn't rely on military conquest to prove herself. Instead, Hatshepsut focused on building, trading, and stability. Her reign saw massive architectural expansion, including her legendary mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, a masterpiece of ancient design nestled into cliffs near Thebes. She also reopened vital trade routes, including a major expedition to Punt, a mysterious gold and incense-rich region believed to be on the Horn of Africa. For over 20 years, she ruled with wisdom, grace, and strategic brilliance. She wasn't just Egypt's first female pharaoh, she was one of its greatest. What's next? Hatshepsut's story might have broken tradition, but it also proved the strength of Egypt's resilience, innovation, and adaptability. And now, with the new kingdom rising and Egypt ready to flex its might, a golden age of warfare, gods, art, and one particularly famous boy king is waiting just ahead. Endless grit continues. Egypt has endured collapse, invasion, and infighting, but again and again it rises. Because for every downfall, there's a leader bold enough to fight back. For every insult, there's a nation ready to reclaim its legacy. And for every impossible challenge, there's endless grit. Hatshepsut, the pharaoh who said, "Nah, I'm good." It turns out, when Egypt isn't constantly launching military campaigns in Nubia every few years, the nation can actually get quite a lot done. Just ask Hatshepsut. She stunned just about every man in the kingdom by building diplomatic relationships with neighboring powers instead of storming into them with swords and chariots. Refreshing, right? But don't mistake diplomacy for modesty. Hatshepsut had a pharaoh-sized ego and wasn't afraid to show it. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari remains one of ancient Egypt's most stunning architectural achievements. Part monument, part masterpiece, it's as if she left a stone-carved mic drop on the landscape. Enter Thutmose III. The Shadow Prince. After her death, her stepson Thutmose III finally got his moment. He probably felt a lot like Prince Charles must have around year 70 of Queen Elizabeth's reign. Polite on the outside, impatient on the inside. And it seems he may have held a small grudge, because once he was in charge, he ordered most images and mentions of Hatshepsut erased, literally chiseling her out of history. Not the most mature move, but hey, pharaohs and pettiness often went hand in hand. Still, Egypt remained strong, until someone came along and decided monotheism was the new vibe. Akhenaten and the one God experiment. When Akhenaten stepped onto the throne, he had a vision, and it came in the shape of a sun disk. He tossed aside Egypt's entire pantheon of gods and declared Aten, the sun disk, as the only god worth worshipping. This was no soft shift. Temples were shut down, priests were sidelined, and the royal family became walking PR for his sun-based ideology. Imagine traveling to Rome and announcing everyone's now going to worship a frisbee. You get the idea. Needless to say, this experiment didn't go over well. Fortunately, someone was waiting in the wings to bring Egypt back to basics. Tutankhamun, the boy who fixed it all, kind of. At just 9 or 10 years old, Tutankhamun, better known today as King Tut, took the throne. Despite his young age, or maybe because of it, one of the first things he did was restore Egypt's traditional religion. In other words, goodbye, frisbee cult. He only ruled for about 9 years and died before the age of 20. The cause is still debated. Some say it was an infection or genetic disorder, but we'll never truly know. An ATV crash is highly unlikely, but hey, it would have been legendary. So why is King Tut the most famous pharaoh of all time? Not because of his reign, but because of his tomb. The tomb that time forgot most tombs in Egypt had long since been looted by grave robbers. But Tutankhamun's burial chamber in the Valley of the Kings was overlooked, buried beneath debris and forgotten construction material. Howard Carter's 1922 discovery shocked the world. A tomb nearly intact, packed with treasures, including the now iconic golden death mask that's become the face of ancient Egypt. That single discovery gave King Tut a kind of posthumous fame most pharaohs could only dream of, plus a SOT next to Batman villains on pop culture lists. Ramses the Great, Egypt's final powerhouse. Next came one of the most legendary figures in Egyptian history, Ramses II. Also called Ramses the Great, he ruled Egypt for an incredible 66 years, 1279 to 1213 BCE, commanding armies, building monuments, and starring in plenty of future Hollywood blockbusters. You might recognize him from the Ten Commandments or the Book of Exodus, depending on your historical source. Though often portrayed as the bad guy, Ramses was also a brilliant general. At the famous Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites in 1274 BCE, considered the largest chariot battle in history, he claimed victory in what was probably a stalemate. But hey, history is written by the king, and Ramses had a knack for turning meh into massive win. The fall and another period of chaos after Ramses II, things went downhill fast. Ramses Hatshepsut, the last pharaoh of the 20th dynasty, saw Egypt break apart. Again, by 1070 BCE, the centralized government had collapsed, and with it came a new age. The Third Intermediate Period. Stop us if you've heard this one before. Power fractured between northern warlords and southern priests, with both sides weakened and vulnerable. Egypt grew ripe for outside invasions, and several new players took their shot. Foreign pharaohs, and first among the most notable were the Libyans, who slipped in and claimed regional power, the Assyrians, who came in swinging and left their mark, the Nubian, who returned the favor after 4,000 years of being invaded by Egypt, and one Nubian ruler in particular, King Paye, or Pi if you're a fan of math jokes, brought history full circle. He ruled 31 years, not quite 314 decades, but close enough. Better yet, Paye was the first black pharaoh of Egypt, proving that the legacy of Egyptian leadership extended beyond borders, beyond prejudice, and beyond what many modern textbooks have cared to highlight. Wrapping up, the legacy of endless grit from god kings to boy kings, sun cults to golden tombs, first queens to foreign rulers. Egypt's story is nothing short of epic, but through every collapse, betrayal, invasion, and change in the ruling class, there's one single thread running through it all: endless grit. It's what made this desert kingdom the longest-lasting civilization in ancient history. It built pyramids, it forged empires, and it kept rising, no matter how many times it fell. Next time on Endless Grit, Cleopatra, Rome, and the final sunset of the pharaohs, the aftershocks in archaeology, theology, and popular culture, and how ancient Egypt shaped the modern world. In ways we barely notice, just hit play. Reunification one more time after the Assyrians pulled out. Egypt found a familiar rhythm: reunite, rebuild, repeat. This time, it was King Samtikver of the 26th dynasty, also known as the Sate dynasty, who brought the pieces back together in 664 BCE. His rule, and those who followed him, wasn't just about stability, it was about restoring Egyptian greatness. This was a cultural revival. Egyptians called it a return to the old ways, and the public rallied behind that vision. Monuments honored tradition, language and religion were revitalized, and support for the dynasty soared. If they'd sold merchandise, hats and hoodies would have flown off the shelves. Then came Persia, but Egypt's success attracted attention. Persian attention. In 525 BCE, Cambyses X, king of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, gave his generals one clear order: bring Egypt into the empire. No excuses. They defeated the army of Pharaoh Psamtik III, and just like that, Egypt became a Persian satrapy, or province, within one of the world's largest empires at the time. Egyptians were tired of worshipping the gods of their ancestors and being told where to place Persian rugs. In 404 BCE, a local leader named Amarteus led a successful revolt. For a brief moment, native Egyptian rule returned, but Persia wasn't done. They came back with force, took the region again, and this time cracked down brutally, imprisoning dissenters, banning gatherings, and punishing rebellion. Saying something unflattering about the king's carpet could get you thrown in prison. Not exactly a model of civil liberty. Enter Alexander the Great and exit the Persians. Again, by 332 BCE, a new conqueror rode into town, Alexander the Great. Unlike past invaders, Alexander was welcomed. He arrived as a liberator, was crowned pharaoh, and, being the empire builder that he was, got straight to work. He founded a city at the mouth of the Nile Delta, and named it after the only person he trusted to run it. Himself, Alexandria quickly became one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world, a place where Egyptians, Greeks, Jews, and people from every corner of the Mediterranean mingled. It housed the legendary Library of Alexandria, a beacon of ancient knowledge and the towering lighthouse of Pharaohs, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Sadly, Alexander's time in Egypt was short-lived. He died just 2 years later. His empire shattered, but his impact here would echo for centuries. The Ptolemies take over. After Alexander's death, his generals divided the empire. Ptolemy I claimed Egypt, founding what would become the Ptolemaic dynasty. Though technically foreign, the Ptolemies were smart. They dressed like Egyptian pharaohs, built temples to ancient gods, and maintained many traditions. But behind the scenes, Greek remained the language of the court, law, and politics. To most common Egyptians, all those fancy government proclamations might as well have been, well, all Greek to them: Cleopatra, the final pharaoh, The last of the Ptolemies would also become the most storied pharaoh in history, Cleopatra Setharth. Fiercely intelligent, multilingual, and politically savvy, Cleopatra fought not just to survive, but to restore independence to Egypt. She presented herself as the living embodiment of Isis and aligned closely with ancient Egyptian traditions, but her biggest plays came through alliances with Rome. First, it was Julius Caesar, with whom she had a son named Caesarion. Then came Mark Antony, Rome's bold general and Cleopatra's closest ally, and eventually her partner in love and war. Together, they dreamed of carving their own future out of the Roman world. But Octavian, Caesar's heir, and future Emperor Augustus labeled them both as threats. The conflict came to a head at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Defeated, Cleopatra and Antony fled back to Egypt, only to realize their dream had crumbled. Mark Antony took his own life. Cleopatra followed, reportedly using poison, though the legend of the asp bite still lingers, and with her, over 3,000 years of pharaonic rule came to an end. Egypt becomes a Roman province. Following Cleopatra's death, Egypt fell beneath Rome's control. It was no longer a land of divine kings and monumental pyramids. It was now a wealthy province of Rome, valuable for its grain, culture, and strategic location in the Mediterranean Sea. Rome would rule Egypt for centuries, but even the empire that conquered the known world could not hold it forever. In 641 AD, Arab Muslim forces from the Rashidun Caliphate conquered Egypt, which, in a way, completes the transition of the region into a new era and truly marks the end of ancient Egypt. Game over? Not quite. So there you have it. From nomadic tribes at the Green Sahara, to divine kings rising along the Nile, to temples, tombs, invasions, revolutions, and reinvention, Egypt's legacy is one of more than 3,000 years of again adapting, ambition, and above all, endless grit. Final word, Egypt may be ancient, but its story is timeless. So whether you came for the queens or the pyramids, or just a killer history lesson with a wink and some irony, thanks for watching. Please drop a like if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you learned anything. And if you didn't, well, subscribe anyway and check out the next one. Because history isn't just about the past, it's about the endless grit that keeps pushing us forward.